General Hospital spoilers reveal that Sidwell was never a man to play by the rules, and now those rules were closing in around him like iron bars. The secret he had worked so hard to bury, the bribe to Judge Heran, was no longer a shadow in his past but a living threat clawing its way into daylight. Whispers that once lingered only in the dark corners of the courtroom had become murmurs in the GCPD. An anonymous source had tipped off the authorities, and though no names were officially named, the implication was deafening. Sidwell's name was dancing at the edge of exposure, and for a man like him, exposure meant obliteration. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated maneuver to control the custody outcome between Michael and Willow was now spiraling into chaos. The bribe, meant to tilt the scales in Michael's favor and ensure that Sonny could be quietly destroyed by implication, had grown tentacles, reaching across legal systems, family courts, and the mob world that Sonny still ruled with his silent, unwavering grip. Sidwell had thought himself 10 steps ahead, but now the walls were closing in, and the only way out was through blood. He could no longer trust anyone, not the enforcers on his payroll, not the errand boys who once trembled at his orders, not even the system he thought he could manipulate. Everything he had built was vulnerable because Judge Heran was still alive. That woman, once pliable, once bought and silenced by the glittering promise of financial salvation, was now a liability too large to ignore. The look in her eyes during their last meeting told him everything he needed to know. She was afraid, not of him, but of the truth, of what she had done, and of who might discover it. And fear made people talk. It was only a matter of time before she cracked, before she confessed, before she dragged him into the very pit he had dug for others. That could not happen. It would not happen. Sidwell made a decision that night. The only way to protect his empire, his revenge, and his fragile alliance with the darker forces at play was to eliminate the judge, permanently. But even in Port Charles, where secrets were currency and death could be a silent transaction, the murder of a judge would send shockwaves through every corner of power. He couldn't just make her disappear. No, he had to make it look like despair, a suicide born from guilt. A forged note. A bottle of pills, a quiet hotel room on the edge of town. His contacts could arrange it. A small team of operatives untraceable to him would carry out the task. The judge would be found in her private suite, alone, with a confession letter by her bedside. It would state that she had accepted money from Sonny Corinthos, that she had manipulated the custody outcome in Michael's favor, and that the weight of her guilt had finally become unbearable. It would be poetic, it would be devastating. If done right, the aftermath would fracture the very family Sidwell had long sought to destroy. Michael would be horrified to learn that Sonny may have been involved. Willow would question everything, including the very trust she had begun to rebuild with Michael. And Sonny, with his name scrawled across a dead judge's suicide note, would be dragged into the eye of a legal storm unlike anything he had faced. Investigations would follow. Prosecutors would demand answers, even if no conviction stuck. The public fallout would be catastrophic. And if, by chance, Sonny was implicated beyond repair, Sidwell's revenge would be complete. The Corinthos name would fall. But plans have a way of turning against their makers. Spinelli, always the quiet genius in the room, had been tracking digital anomalies long before Sidwell's operatives moved into action. What he initially considered loose ends in the custody trial's paperwork soon appeared to be signs of tampering, metadata altered, timestamps misaligned, judicial orders logged from unfamiliar IPs. Spinelli had taken it to Felicia, who in turn whispered it to Mac, who understood the gravity instantly. Something was wrong. Judge Heran hadn't just ruled, she had been manipulated, coerced. Or worse. And suddenly, they were watching her, trying to get close without alerting the wrong people. But they were already too late. The operation was in motion. The night Judge Heran died, it was cold and silent. She had told her clerk she was going home early. She never did. Instead, she checked into a secluded room with a view of the harbor. A place no one could find her unless they already knew. Sidwell's men arrived just before midnight, quiet as ghosts. They left no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, only the note. Carefully written in her style, folded beside a glass of red wine laced with heavy sedatives. Her body would be found hours later by housekeeping. The news broke by noon. Judge Heran, dead by apparent suicide, after confessing to taking bribes from Sonny Corinthos. Port Charles went into shock. The courthouse was shuttered for investigation. But he had no proof. Michael, devastated, confronted Sonny privately. There were no accusations, not yet, only hurt, the kind that cuts deeper because it comes from love. He asked if Sonny had done it. Sonny denied it, but the wedge was already driven. Willow, shaken by the possibility that her children's future had been shaped by corruption, began to withdraw. The fragile peace they had created was fracturing. Meanwhile, Spinelli doubled down on his investigation. He discovered a deleted message chain between a prepaid burner phone and a secure government line. The burner, traced through dark web proxies, led to one of Sidwell's known shell companies. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to make Mac reopen the case unofficially. Felicia, never one to sit quietly, convinced Anna to help. What started as quiet inquiries soon became a full-fledged underground investigation into Sidwell's network, and suddenly, those who once worked for him began to disappear. Fear had its own contagion, and Sidwell's men were running. But Sidwell wasn't finished. His next move would be even darker, a direct attack on Spinelli, whose digging had come too close. A staged robbery, a planted file, something to smear him as a hacker for hire. Sidwell would use the very tools Spinelli trusted to ruin his name and credibility. The game was turning bloody. Sonny, sensing the threat, pulled Jason back into the fold. Britt, watching from the shadows, realized her own past might soon entangle with this storm. As rumors spread that some of Sidwell's funds had passed through the same offshore accounts linked to DVX. As bodies fall and secrets rise, the war isn't over, it's only begun. Judge Heran's death was the first domino. Sidwell believes he's still in control, but he's underestimated the loyalty that binds this town. Michael's grief may turn to rage. Willow's disillusionment may evolve into clarity. And Sonny, long hunted, long feared, may finally have a reason to strike back not just as a father, but as a man with nothing left to lose. And in that final reckoning, Sidwell will learn what true exposure feels like. Not in headlines, but in blood. Sidwell had not merely orchestrated a trap for Sonny, he had rewritten the rules of warfare in Port Charles. The death of Judge Eva Heran was no random tragedy. No accidental misstep in the tangled corridors of justice. It was a masterstroke, calculated and cold, carried out with precision and purpose. It marked the beginning of what could only be described as a brutal restructuring of the power dynamics that had long ruled the city. Heran's sudden and suspicious death, staged as a suicide and supported by a fabricated confession letter implicating Sonny in a bribery scheme, set into motion a series of events that would unravel reputations, destroy alliances, and leave the city's most powerful figures scrambling for clarity in a fog of deception. The impact was immediate and widespread. Headlines screamed scandal. Whispers flooded the Metro Court and crept through police stations. The public, long divided between admiration and fear of Sonny, turned their gaze toward him with a new kind of suspicion, not for his past as a mob boss, but as a man who might have manipulated the legal system for personal gain. The forged letter painted him as a calculating force willing to corrupt the courts for custody of his grandchildren. The very image of Sonny as a protector of family and honor shattered. Replaced by an image Sidwell had sculpted from the shadows, a man clinging to control at any cost. But what no one knew, not Sonny, not Michael, not Willow, not even the WSB, was that Sidwell's plan went far deeper than one forged confession. The letter was bait, but the trap was multi-layered. Sidwell had already begun placing pressure on lower court officials, threatening them with exposure of long-buried secrets or tempting them with promises of promotion and protection. He infiltrated key institutions not with guns or goons but with influence and leverage. And as the judge's death triggered an emergency review of all custody rulings she had made in the past year, Sidwell ensured Michael's victory would now seem tainted, undeserved, and potentially reversible, creating rifts between Michael and Willow and setting Sonny up for an even greater fall. Behind the scenes, Sidwell fed the press carefully timed leaks, pointing to irregularities in Heran's rulings. He paid off an anonymous whistleblower who claimed Heran had been in communication with someone in Sonny's inner circle. He commissioned private investigations, all staged to look independent. That conveniently uncovered bank transfers and vacation properties suggesting corruption. And when these findings began circulating in hushed tones and exclusive news briefs, the WSB could no longer ignore the scandal that now hovered over Port Charles like a storm cloud. The chaos this created was exactly what Sidwell wanted, not outright destruction, but slow, corrosive decay. He didn't need Sonny in handcuffs, he needed Sonny paralyzed, surrounded by doubt, and weakened from within. And that's exactly what was happening. Carly was forced to distance herself publicly from Sonny to protect her businesses. Diane was reluctant to take on his case again without a full investigation. Even Jason, long the unshakable ally, began to quietly investigate the origins of the confession letter, knowing something didn't add up, and fearing that Sonny's usual playbook might not save them this time. But the deadliest part of Sidwell's scheme wasn't what he had already done, it was what he was preparing to do next. With Heran gone and the spotlight now fixed on Sonny, Sidwell had space to act freely. He began purchasing silent stakes in media outlets across the region, planting stories and shaping public perception. He manipulated the market around Corinthos coffee, buying up supply chains and pressuring vendors to break contracts. He even began to infiltrate the foundation boards and civic groups that Sonny had once used for influence and legitimacy, replacing key players with loyalists. And all the while, he maintained a clean public image, a grieving philanthropist who had tragically lost his beloved friend Heran and now sought only justice and reform in her memory. Meanwhile, Sonny was left to fight shadows. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, but every time he reached out to pull a thread, it slipped through his fingers. His enemies weren't mobsters anymore, they were invisible hands tightening the noose, and even he didn't fully understand who was holding the rope. His health began to suffer under the strain. His family grew more distant. Even his most trusted allies began making quiet backup plans in case the empire fell. And through it all, Sidwell kept his distance, never striking directly. Always appearing as a third party, a bystander, a man seeking justice for a corrupt judge and the families her rulings may have damaged. But Sidwell hadn't forgotten the endgame. He knew that eventually, Sonny would discover the truth, or at least suspect it. And that's when he planned to deliver the final blow. Rumors had begun circulating that the forged confession letter had originated from inside a law office with ties to the WSB. If Sonny pursued that path, if he dug too deeply, Sidwell had a fallback plan, to leak audio of Heran in a fabricated confession video that would make even the forged note seem tame. He had already hired an actress to impersonate her voice. He had already begun crafting the footage with a digital artist. In this new war, truth was a weapon to be bent, reshaped, and aimed like a blade. What made Sidwell's campaign so effective was that he never asked for anything in return. He didn't extort Sonny, didn't demand favors or concessions. He simply dismantled him, piece by piece, from the outside in. And as the pressure built and Port Charles slowly began to tilt on its axis, only a few people, Jason, Anna, perhaps even Dante, began to glimpse the full picture. But even they were late. Sidwell had already laid the groundwork. He had already exposed the fractures. All he had to do now was watch them break. The death of Eva Heran had been the match. But Port Charles was already soaked in gasoline. Sidwell hadn't just adjusted the narrative, he had rewritten the entire future. And now, all that remained was to see who would burn first. The court's decision to overturn Judge Heran's ruling and award Willow full custody of her and Michael's children marked a devastating blow not only to Michael's confidence but to Sonny's entire stand. Ding in Port Charles. The moment the gavel fell, everything changed. What had once been a hard-fought legal victory suddenly collapsed under the weight of scandal, suspicion, and a deadly conspiracy orchestrated behind closed doors. And though few could see the puppet master's strings, it became increasingly clear that the destruction wasn't incidental, it was designed. Sidwell had struck again, and this time, he struck the very core of Sonny's identity, his family. For Michael, the court's reversal was humiliating. He had walked into the courtroom with the assurance of having already won, backed by a ruling that granted him full custody, an outcome rarely seen unless the mother posed a verifiable risk. But now, the victory was tainted, exposed as a manipulated decision made by a now-dead judge whose integrity had crumbled in the eyes of the law. The forged letter, the fabricated suicide, the supposed confession, all of it had been planted to unseat Sonny, but the fallout was broader, crueler, and far more destructive than Michael had anticipated. His name was now tied to judicial corruption, even if he had no hand in it. He was the unwitting face of a legal scam, and his fight for his children had become a symbol of injustice. But the real target had always been Sonny. The reversal of the custody ruling was more than a loss, it was a symbol of collapse. The court's official language, voiding Heran's prior decisions and reopening every case she had ruled on in the last year, ensured that Sonny would be entangled in litigation for months, if not years. His enemies had more ammunition than ever, and his public support waned as journalists questioned whether Sonny had tried to buy justice through a compromised judge. Though no direct evidence tied Sonny to the alleged bribery, the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. The whispers had grown into roars. The once feared mobster now looked like a man cornered, betrayed, and unraveling. Sidwell, for his part, emerged from the chaos as a victor cloaked in moral righteousness. He made public statements mourning the loss of Judge Heran while calling for widespread legal reforms. He spoke of transparency, justice, and accountability. He positioned himself as an ally of the people, even as he continued to manipulate every lever of power behind the scenes. His calculated silence about the letter's true origins only fed the flames. While Sonny bled in public, Sidwell reaped the rewards in private, forming new partnerships, expanding his influence, and slowly replacing every institution Sonny had once controlled with his own surrogates. What made the moment so shocking, so unforgiving, was that Sonny seemed powerless to stop it. The walls were closing in. Carly began re-evaluating her role in his life, fearing the legal scrutiny could spill over into her own ventures. Dante, torn between his badge and his blood, tried to remain neutral but could no longer defend his father without compromising his own career. Even Jason, usually stoic and steady, began making quiet inquiries to former allies in the WSB. Realizing the web was bigger than anyone had anticipated. And still, Sidwell advanced. The court's decision not only cost Sonny his legal credibility, it shattered the image he had built for decades as a protector, a father, a man of control. Now, he looked like a liability. Even allies like Brick and Diane were considering distancing themselves, watching the empire tremble from within. Sidwell didn't need to assassinate Sonny in the streets. He had already assassinated his reputation. He didn't need to destroy Corinthos coffee, he only had to make it too toxic for suppliers. Every step Sonny took to regain his footing was already anticipated, blocked, or spun against him. And through it all, Sidwell smiled from the shadows. This wasn't just a story about a custody battle. It was a war. And the battlefield was perception, legality, and control. With one forged letter, one dead judge, and one overturned ruling, Sidwell had shifted the axis of power in Port Charles. And as Sonny watched his world fracture, as Michael realized the full cost of their entanglement, and as Willow quietly wept in a courtroom that had been turned into a battlefield, the truth became undeniable. Sidwell had not only won this round, he had changed the game forever. Sidwell's ambition knew no bounds. And with the success of Judge Heran's fall now secured behind him like a dark trophy, he set his sights on a much broader battlefield, Port Charles itself. The corruption scandal surrounding Heran was not the endgame but merely the opening move in a much larger, far more insidious campaign. He had tasted the power of disruption. And now he would weaponize it. His strategy no longer relied on subtle manipulation or whispered rumors. Sidwell was unleashing chaos by design. And this chaos, meticulously engineered, was already pushing Sonny and Michael into a dangerous new phase of public disgrace, internal collapse, and irreversible division. With the courts now in turmoil and Judge Heran posthumously disgraced, Sidwell moved quickly. He funneled anonymous complaints to the Bar Association questioning the legitimacy of Diane's legal influence. He leaked false financial records suggesting that Corinthos Coffee had laundered money through Heran's charitable foundation. He even began recruiting former members of rival syndicates who had long feared Sonny's dominance, using their grudges as leverage to build a coalition of silent enemies. The message was clear. The Cassadine legacy may have fallen, but a new power was rising, one unafraid to play in the shadows and burn bridges to seize control. Every corner of Port Charles became vulnerable, every institution suddenly open to infiltration, every reputation a potential casualty. For Michael, the nightmare worsened. The court's custody reversal painted him as a man unfit to hold his own victories, and as media outlets swarmed the story, Michael found himself unable to protect Willow from the shame or shield their children from the whispers. Investors pulled out of Aurora. Shareholders questioned his leadership. Even Ned began probing the legitimacy of Michael's decisions, wondering if aligning with Sonny had irreparably tainted the Quartermaine brand. What began as a personal legal battle had become a corporate infection, and Michael had no cure. His rage against Sidwell boiled silently beneath the surface, but without proof, without allies. All he could do was watch as his influence crumbled, one press release, one false report, one anonymous leak at a time. Meanwhile, Sonny's grip on his empire weakened with every passing day. His warehouse operations were disrupted by anonymous inspections. Customs officials delayed shipments. Trusted lieutenants began disappearing, some arrested, others simply gone without a trace. The DA, once hesitant to engage with Sonny, now felt emboldened by the public outrage and quietly reopened old cases, citing new interest in ethical transparency. The more Sonny resisted, the more evidence seemed to surface: financial links, recorded calls, emails that may or may not have been forged but looked devastatingly real. And the more he defended himself, the more people began to wonder, had Sonny actually bribed Heran? Was this the end of an era? Sidwell, watching from the shadows, expanded his reach like a virus. He wasn't merely targeting Sonny and Michael. He was setting fire to the entire structure that supported them. He whispered in the ears of local politicians, promised funding for campaigns, and hinted at dirt on anyone who opposed him. He knew that the fall of Sonny was symbolic. If the most untouchable man in Port Charles could be brought down not with bullets but with ink, silence, and strategic fear, then Sidwell could rule without lifting a gun. And now, he was ready to push even further. Sidwell began planting seeds of discord among Sonny's allies. Carly received an anonymous file containing photos of Sonny meeting with Heran, doctored, but convincing enough to stir doubt. Jason received a threatening message suggesting that if he didn't walk away, the next scandal would involve him. Even Dante began to question how much his badge could protect him if the corruption rumors reached the department. And still, Sidwell pressed on. Port Charles began to feel like a city under siege, not by bombs or bullets, but by erosion of trust, silent disappearances, and a slow bleed of everything that once felt secure. The citizens didn't know Sidwell's name yet, but they felt his presence. Schools lost funding due to restructured taxes. Hospitals began turning away patients after grant money vanished. Now stood on opposite shores of an emotional gulf. Michael blamed Sonny for the scandal that cost him his children. Sonny blamed Michael for not trusting him. And Sidwell watched, pleased. As the bond cracked, knowing the final break was coming. He would not need to kill Sonny to win. He only needed to ensure Sonny was alone, exposed, and powerless when the final blow came. And that blow, still secret, still forming, was going to tear through everything they'd built. Sidwell had no intention of stopping. The fall of Judge Heran was only the beginning. The deaths. The arrests, the ruined reputations, they were all stepping stones toward his true vision, total control of Port Charles, executed not with violence, but with fear, manipulation, and psychological warfare. And as the darkness closed in around Sonny and Michael, as trust collapsed, as loyalty became a liability, it was clear to anyone watching, Sidwell was winning. And he had only just begun.